Forgot that I was supposed to introduce my husband while he got his computer ready. So here I am introducing my wonderful husband who agreed to speak to us about relationships with believing family and friends. And this is because he was an active member for a long time. He had a brother leave the church who came out as gay and got married, and all while Dave was a very believing, active member. And then his two older kids left the church, and he kept up a good relationship with all of them because he loved them. And then when we left the church 3 years ago, he still had two believing children in the church, and they both went on missions. And he gave them advice all through the missions and loved them. And so I asked him to talk on how to have good relationships with believing family and friends. And here he is.
I'm an exceptionally lucky human being, and I want to acknowledge that at the very beginning of this talk, because if there's one thing I need you to really understand is that while I have some amazing relationships with both believers and non-believers in my family, I firmly believe and I wholeheartedly recognize that I won the lottery, because if we're going to have a great relationship with anybody, it requires participation from both. I'm going to give some ideas today. I'm going to share with you some things that I've done that have helped in my relationships, and I want everybody to recognize that I'm fully aware that because it worked for me doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody, because I have relationships where these things have worked miraculously, and I have other relationships where they have not. And I would just ask that everybody recognize that I don't want to preach. I have no formal qualifications. I'm just a guy who's really, really lucky to have some really great relationships, and I want to share some of the things that I've done that I think have impacted that. So, as Carol said, I have 4 children who never cease to amaze me. 2 left the church in their teen years. One of them came back from her mission, and within a year started into a faith transition, and she's right in the thick of it right now. And then I have another one that returned from a mission about 3 months ago and is currently engaged, about to get married in the temple. So they kind of run the gamut. I also have a relationship with the mother of those 4 children, my former spouse, who is still one of my very best friends and someone who I value my relationship with extremely highly. The reason I give you that background, in the process of going through my faith transition, as many of you have done, I found myself challenging a lot of my beliefs. I realized that Mormonism no longer holds moral authority over me, and so I have to put my big boy pants on, and I've got to start doing some work in answering the questions: what do I believe? What do I value? What is important? What am I going to use to guide my life? And in that process, I landed on a lot of things that I feel are important, but honestly, one, let's call it a value, seemed to rise to the top. And it's probably the single most powerful guiding principle in my life today, and that is grace. The willingness to offer grace to ourselves, to others. So I want to talk a little bit about it today. I believe that if we can learn to lead with grace, it can have a fundamental positive impact on all of our relationships. Now, how do you define grace? It's kind of a sticky thing to try to define. I'm going to tell you what I believe grace is. And I'm probably not going to do a great job of it, but I can kind of sum it up with a wonderful meme that I saw about 20 years back before there were memes, and we just faxed stuff back, 30 years ago, we faxed stuff back and forth to each other. I saw this meme, and it was basically a list of rules that everybody wishes their spouse or partner would be willing to live by. And one of them that jumped out at me was this: if I say something to you, and it can be interpreted 2 ways, and one of those ways hurts you, makes you feel sad or angry, I meant the other one. It's kind of funny. But the more I thought about it, I went, wow, what a powerful guiding principle for our lives. What if in all of our relationships, in every interaction, every time somebody said something, we can take it 2 ways, we just made the decision to assume they meant the one that makes us feel good rather than bad. And you know what the really cool thing is? Every one of us has the power to do it because that's simply a choice. It's that easy. I'm not saying you won't have emotions going both directions, but you get to choose what assumptions you're going to make. Fair enough? All right, so let's talk a little bit about grace. I have found in my life that people, myself included, often judge ourselves based on our best intentions because we know that we are way more than the sum total of the worst decisions that we've made at the worst moments of our lives. And we offer ourselves grace. Now, I know there's a lot of people sitting out there that have struggled with that. I have at times struggled with that. And I have not offered myself enough grace. But I think a lot of people in a lot of cases in their lives actually do. Here's the interesting thing. While we are more than happy to judge ourselves based on our best intentions, often I find that I sometimes want to judge others based on their worst behaviors that play out in some of the hardest, most challenging moments of their lives. So what does grace mean to me? To extend grace is simply to resist the urge to judge the entirety of another person's character based on a poor behavior that happened in one of the worst moments of their lives. That's grace as far as I define it. Okay, with that bit of context, I had this whole presentation where I was going to give you all these tips for maintaining good relationships, but you know, the Spirit kind of moved on me. I kind of feel impressed that, no, I'm just kidding. I do want to share a story with you though. I had a fascinating conversation just literally a couple days ago. I have a very dear friend. Sterling is a currently serving bishop in the church. We've been friends for decades, fishing buddies, 3 a.m. runs to Beto's to get burritos, the whole works. And we've stayed in touch, and he's seen and known that I've been kind of going through a transition. But we've never actually had the hard conversation, the I'm out conversation. And so I want to talk about that coming out conversation because it's a pivotal moment. In a lot of relationships, it is one of those make or break moments. And if we handle it the right way, it can actually strengthen our relationship. And if we handle it the wrong way, it can actually damage the relationship. So Sterling and I were headed down the road in this conversation, and it became very obvious to me, oops, here we go. And I felt the need to kind of frame that conversation because I knew we were going to say some really hard things. I want to share with you some of the direct quotes, direct things that he said to me on this call. He said, Dave, I disagree with everything you just said. When was the last time you were in the temple? When was the last time you really studied the Book of Mormon? President Nelson recently said, by the way, I told you I might be a little triggering today. I apologize. Please be careful and don't let Satan take control of your eternal destiny. That one was fun. Satan is such a great deceiver. I really need you to know that I know it's true. Okay, that can be a hard conversation. But one of the most important lessons I've learned in life is that the attitude that we carry into a conversation will powerfully impact the outcome of that conversation. We get to choose. Did they mean the first or the other? That make sense? All right, so coming out conversation. As we headed into this, I stopped and I said, Sterling, look, this conversation is headed somewhere that it's going to be hard. You've asked a couple questions and I want to be completely truthful with you, but if we're going to have this conversation, and this is basically what I said to him, I wanted to start the conversation with this. I said, you need to understand I love you, full stop. Regardless of how you feel about me at the end of this conversation, I want you to know I will love you. Our relationship is always going to be incredibly meaningful and important to me. I'm probably going to say some things that are going to be hurtful. They may make you angry. I promise we're going to disagree, but I'm going to ask you to trust in our relationship enough to know that I would never do anything to deliberately hurt you. And candidly, the only reason I'm confident having this conversation with you is that I have confidence enough in our relationship to know that we can withstand being completely honest with each other. That, to me, is how you frame a conversation. Because now he knows the attitude I'm carrying into the conversation. He doesn't have to be defensive. He gets to choose how he reacts, but that's going to impact the way he's going to react. That conversation could have gone a couple of ways. And I wish I had a recording, because I bet you that if I played it for different people, we would identify two very, very different potential outcomes from that call. The first one, if we take a more defensive or a perspective of leading with defensiveness, the assumptions that you might carry into that call would be something like, Sterling's going to be angry. He's going to be judgmental. He's going to be condescending. He's going to be preachy, triggering. And you know what? He was. In some ways, he was kind of all those things. But if I carry that attitude into the conversation, my likely outcome would have been, in his misguided attempt to save me, Sterling, all he did was prove that he isn't really my friend. I mean, if he was really my friend, he would never talk to me like that. And it's clear that all he cares about is superficial relationships and virtue signaling. Spoiler alert, that was not the outcome of the call. Because there's a second perspective that you can carry into a conversation like that. And that's the perspective of leading with grace. My assumptions going into that call with Sterling were, Sterling's going to be feeling some fear. He's going to be feeling sadness, a sense of loss, concern, a desire to save me. So, I need to be aware of the fact that these emotions are probably going to cause him some pain. I need to remember that I was once a believer. I remember how I felt when my children told me that they were leaving the church. And I need to recognize that it's not going to be a comfortable thing for him. And I need to extend grace enough to him to assume that he's not going into this conversation with any kind of malice in his heart for me. Fair enough? Well, those are the assumptions I carried into the conversation. The outcome of that conversation for me was something like this. Sterling's attempt to save me, and make no mistake, I got a sermon. He tried to save me. It was a beautiful expression of his love and his concern for me. It was a clear statement that he valued me and our relationship. And I knew that it took courage for him to do that. He was authentic, he was genuine, and even though we both have deeply held beliefs that are at complete odds with each other, I left the conversation with greater respect for him and more confidence in our relationship than I had walking into the call. There's nothing special about me. The conversation was framed properly. The right attitude was carried in, not just by me. And this is why I want to be really, really careful here. You do not have the responsibility for how the other person is going to come to the conversation. You only get to control the attitude that you bring into the conversation. I hope for your sake that you have experiences like this where the person on the other end of the line is willing to approach it the same way. The good news is they happen. The two best friends I have on this planet today are Sterling, sitting bishop, great friend, and a former mission companion, also a bishop, also a lifetime friend. And both of them, I had two of the most connecting conversations I've ever had in my life with those individuals. It can happen. Okay, I want to talk really quickly about how this applies to maintaining relationships. But we need to examine really quickly the emotions that I felt when I left the church. And I'm going to buzz through these. There was fear, death of the afterlife, all kinds of things like that. There was sadness because I realized I just wasted 2/3 of my life. There was a lot of guilt over the fact that I wasn't good enough to maintain my faith. And there was loss of hope that came from the plan of salvation. I found myself re-mourning the deaths of my mother, my child, my grandfather, my best friend. That's hard. But there's some other emotions that I felt. I felt anger. But you need to know where that anger was placed. It was placed at the church because they had deceived me. I was angry at the church's bad behavior. I was feeling judgment because I knew people were looking at me as a sinner. I felt condescension. I felt like I was being talked to like a CTR, right? And just lean on me because I know. Ugh. Now, those are the emotions I felt when I left the church. But can I talk about the emotions that I felt when my children did? I felt fear, different kind of fear, because now my fear is about, geez, I'm losing my eternal relationship with my child. They're losing their eternal salvation. That was terrifying. I felt sadness. Oh my gosh, My relationship with my kids is never going to be that great in this life, and their lives are going to be meaningless and devoid of anything that represents happiness. Because, wickedness never was happiness. I felt guilt, horrifying guilt, because I hadn't been a good enough patriarch, and I didn't do scripture study and family home evening enough. And I felt loss. Mostly this loss of this beautiful vision that I had in my mind of my family living our perfect eternal life in our mansions in heaven. It was painful. But you want to know some of the emotions I didn't feel when my children left? I didn't feel anger towards them. I didn't feel judgment towards them. I felt no disrespect, and I certainly didn't feel any sense of superiority. I'm going to say that again. I felt no anger towards them, no judgment, no disrespect, and no sense of superiority. Felt all that directed at me when I left, felt none of it directed at my kids. How many of you, while you were believing members of the church, had family members that left? Raise your hands high. I need to see them. I want to ask you some questions. What were the emotions that you experienced? Did you feel anger and bitterness towards your loved ones that left? Did you feel like you were superior to them? Did you feel judgment towards them? Did you feel like they were no longer worthy of your love and respect? Did you feel the need to cut them out of your life? And I would ask this, if you didn't feel this towards them, how much sense does it make for us to assume that our loved ones feel that way about us? Just sit with that for a second. That was an aha moment for me. How much of what we feel in terms of judgment and all of that we feel directed at us, how much of it is real? And how much of it is us projecting our beliefs? Lead with grace. One of the most powerful tools for maintaining a relationship. Those we love are very likely going to experience some hard emotions, but they're going to be feelings of fear, sadness, loss, not anger, judgment, disrespect, or superiority. Showing grace means recognizing that those emotions, they will create pain, and they're going to lead to often some less than ideal reactions. But we don't need to let those reactions define those people. We need to remember how we felt and how we reacted when we were a believer and had those experiences. We need to extend others the grace to make mistakes. I had an experience not 20 minutes ago where I did something I really wish I hadn't done. It was a little slip up. And I'm incredibly grateful for the grace that was extended to me. The person who extended that grace knows who they are, but they're sitting in this room. Thank you. Thank you for being willing to extend me grace, because I'm not perfect. Now here's the problem with grace. You ready? Bad news. Grace is hard, and it's scary, because it requires a lot of patience, and it requires a tremendous amount of vulnerability, and vulnerability carries the risk of getting hurt. That's the bad news. Now the good news, grace also carries with it the promise of amazing reward, and that reward looks like relationships that are richer and deeper and more connected. They're full of authenticity. Those kinds of relationships can happen, but they require grace. All right. A couple quick tips and then I'm out of here because I think I'm over time. I didn't get my timer started. These are. I'm going to blow through them, and this might be a little hard to hear, and I'm not trying to be judgy because I'm guilty of every one of these. But as post-Mormons, most of us have felt ignored. But I would ask that each of you ask yourselves, how often have you or have we as a group made the assumption that we're going to be judged and withdrawn from our social circles rather than reaching out? We often feel disrespected, but I would ask you, how many of us have ever rolled our eyes while using the term TBM as a pejorative to describe our believing family and friends? As a community, I believe we can do better. I think we can do better. We felt treated unkindly, but how many of us have then returned an unkindness rather than going out of our way to do something kind for a believing family member or spouse? This is the big one. This I hear more than anybody, or any other response. How have you felt that sense of leaving? I felt judged. But do we judge? How many times have we said, if they were really a good person, they aren't really who you think they are. They aren't who they want you to believe they are. This is the big one. Geez, with them, it's always about virtue signaling. Can we do better? I think we can. I think we need to. Never try to interpret. Here's what I mean. How many times have you heard someone say, well, they said X, but based on Y, I know what they really mean is Z. A perfect example, because every one of us have experienced it. I have heard this almost word for word. They said they don't think less of me, but based on the fact that their whole family's like super Mormon, I know that they're actually really worried about what others are going to think when they're hanging out with me. How unbelievably unfair of us is it to assume that we know what's in somebody's heart and mind better than they know themselves? How much of the judgment that we feel is real, and how much of it is imagined? Interpreting can be dangerous because it can lead you to all kinds of conclusions that just aren't reality, and they can damage relationships. I'm going to show you one that most of us have seen or heard, and it has made our blood boil. But I want you to remember how many of us have also said they're super Mormon, so what they really mean is this. Okay? Here it is. They said they left because of truth claims, but you know what? I've seen them drinking coffee and wearing short shorts with no garments on Sunday while they're out in the yard cutting their grass. So in reality, the truth is they probably are just lazy and want to sin. Makes your blood boil, doesn't it? So should it not make our blood boil when we think about doing the same thing to others? You want to maintain great relationships? Avoid interpreting. Allow people the honor and respect of believing that they mean what they say. Can I say that again? Allow people the honor and respect of believing that they mean what they say, not how you're interpreting what they're saying. Fair enough? It'll change your relationships. All right, last thing, don't make assumptions, and I can sum this up without saying anything. You ready? Here we go. Boom. Here's my absolute best advice on assumptions. You ready? If you must make an assumption, thanks, folks.